Welcome back to the Seaboard Central, everyone. I'm Tim Garland, owner of the Seaboard Central. I'm also a professional railroader and been working for Norfolk Southern Corporation for over 26 years now. I started out as a brakeman, worked my way up as a conductor, finally as a locomotive engineer, and I've done that for most of my career. But for 7 years, I also worked as a supervisor in rail car management, where I distributed different types of rail cars owned by Norfolk Southern. It was during those 7 years I learned all about railroad operations, how car forwarding works, and waybill operation. So I thought I'd produce a new series on how to make your operations on your model railroad more realistic. So if you find that interesting, keep watching and stay tuned. To better understand the Seaboard Central, let's look at the system map. As you can see, most of the trackage occurs in Georgia and there's trackage in Alabama. The Seaboard Central is made up of former Seaboard Coastline and Central of Georgia tracks. For instance, the line between Savannah and Macon, Georgia was an old Seaboard Coastline track. The line from Macon up to Griffin in Atlanta and over to Sonoya through Carrollton and Cedartown, all this trackage, even from Barnesville down to Thomaston, was Central Georgia. The line from Cedartown over to Cartersville, the original Seaboard Central, was a Seaboard Coastline branch, and also from Cedartown over to Birmingham was part of the Seaboard Coastline. And then finally, we have a line from Wellington up through Gunnersville that was actually an L&N line. So the Seaboard Central interchanges with 3 Class 1 railroads. In Birmingham, it interchanges with both the BNSF and the CSX. In Gadsden, around Attala, Alabama, it interchanges with Norfolk Southern. In Cartersville, it interchanges with the CSX. In Atlanta, it interchanges with Norfolk Southern. In Macon, it interchanges with Norfolk Southern. And finally, in Savannah, it interchanges with both the Norfolk Southern and the CSX. Now, where my original layout was focused around Griffin, Georgia, and the operations there, the new layout is being built to be focused on operations in Carrollton and Noonan, Georgia, in this area. But also, I'm going to include a work-in staging yard that's going to represent Gadsden, Alabama, and have a section that we're going to be talking about for this operations video in this area called Raglan, Alabama. Now, this is the plan for the vision of how I hope the layout to eventually be. And this is the area that's going to represent Carrollton, Georgia, all through here in this room. And then I'm going to have Noonan represented in this room. But the layout is actually starting in this area. And here's the Gadsden yard that's actually a work-in staging yard. And then this area that we're going to talk about is Raglan, which has already been completed, Raglan, Alabama. So here's a blown up drawing of the trackage over in the west end of the yard. This includes the yard at Gadsden and also the trackage in Raglan, which has already been completed. And as you can see from this shot, work has already started on the Gadsden yard. So the first thing we need to talk about on how to make your railroad operations more realistic is how you plan on operating it, and that is the method of operation. When it comes to the movement of trains and engines on the prototype, we have certain rules that we need to follow. And the first rule is rule number 93, it's main track within yard limits. You can see item A says yard limits are designated in the timetable and indicated by yard limit signs. And item B shows that all train and engine movements within yard limits must be made at restricted speed unless operating on a block signal indication that is more favorable than approach. And that's in the case where the main line has signals. Item C says a train or engine must not move against the current of traffic within yard limits until provision has been made for the protection of the movement, and the movement must be made at restricted speed. And basically, if the yard is larger and it has a yard master, before you make any kind of moves, you need to contact the yard master. This rule number 93 is what's going to govern the trackage of my Gadsden yard on the Seaboard Central. The next rule we're going to talk about is rule number 171, and this is non-signal track mandatory directive authorized movement. And it says, where designated by a bulletin or special instruction, the use of the main track will be authorized by issuance of a mandatory directive under the direction and over the initials of the train dispatcher. And this is basically just talking about track warrants. So non-signaled mainline tracks that are operated with track warrants are in the new era track authorities. This is also what I'll be using on the Seaboard Central, rule number 171. It covers track warrants on non-signaled track. Now I'll go over a few more of these rules. They don't apply to the Seaboard Central, but they may apply in your case. The first one is 251, and that's track signaled in one direction. And this is basically something that used to happen years ago. There's a lot of double track. They had signals that governed each main line, so it was like a east-west. One track was designated for movement running east-west or north-south, and the other one was vice versa. They were all automatic block signals. That means the dispatcher had no control over the signals. And how the trains were controlled was through train orders, timetable and train order. And today, that's would also be replaced with track warrants or track authorities. So the next rule we'll talk about is rule number 261, otherwise known as CTC, or centralized traffic control, where the track is signaled in both directions and the signals authorize movement. This is the rule most people are probably familiar with, and that is that signal indications will govern all movements within each block. And the signals, the control point signals, and often the turnouts leading into a siding or in double track are controlled by a dispatcher. The last rule we'll talk about is rule number 271, and this is where track is signaled in both directions and a mandatory directive authorizes movement. Where rule number 251, the track was signaled in one direction, and that was in double track. In this case, 271, this is a single track, also has automatic block signals, but the dispatchers cannot control the signals. The way they control the movements back in the old days was issuing a train order. The new days, track warrants or track authorities. So just to recap, on the Seaboard Central, Gadsden Yard, all the way up the Helix to about right here is going to be rule number 93, yard limits. And I'll have yard limit signs posted in this area right here. Now this part, this section, is rule 171, which will be track warrants or track authorities to control the movement on the main line at this location. So this first step is completely optional, but it could add a layer of fun to your operations if you want to operate more like the prototype. What you're looking at is some dispatcher bulletins. These are my dispatcher bulletins from yesterday that for my particular train I operated. You can see here it is, train P56 of the 13th. Here I am as the engineer. There's my conductor. We were on duty at 6 a.m. The engines I operated was NS 7107 and NS 1824. 7107 is a GP60. 1824 is a rebuilt SD70 ACC. Most important part of this is the train clearance number. And this goes way back. You had to even have a train clearance number back when in timetable and train order. This basically gives you clearance to operate over the main line. Doesn't give you authorization to access the main line. It just gives you clearance to operate. This is your clearance number. Mine yesterday was 5470. This shows the limits that the dispatcher has cleared our train for, even though that's way more than what we operated. We only stayed in Chambly. Next up is our mandatory directives, and this lists our slow orders or any kind of special instructions that we need to be aware of. Right here you can see there's a 49 mile per hour speed restriction located at milepost 541.4 due to some kind of Sperry defect. There's a lot of pages of this stuff, but I'm not going to go through them. I'm just going to go over another one. Here's right-of-way conditions, and this shows if there's tracks out of service. Here's an auxiliary track out of service located at the 620.9, and it just shows that it's out of service due to tie conditions. So here's something fun I thought I would do to give to my crews. I give my crews their paperwork on a clipboard like this, and here is their dispatcher bulletins. You can see Seaboard Central Railroad Company Rail Traffic Control Clearance, and it lists the train number, where it was called from, milepost 691 at Raglan, Alabama. Engineer on duty at 8 a.m., conductor. Here's the engine numbers. Here's some things that I included. There's the clearance number, 1001. Here's the limits. Shows Wellington to Birmingham District, milepost 673.4 to 736.6. Here's something I thought would be fun to include, a 10 mile per hour speed restriction at the 690.5 over State Route 144 crossing to count rusty rail conditions. Here's another speed restriction, 15 miles per hour at the 690.6 between milepost 690.6 and 691.8 due to track conditions. And then here's some right-of-way conditions. I just thought there's the track that's out of service at the 690.7. I did account the tie conditions. And here's some bad footing due to some track material stored. And I'll show this over on the layout. And here's a message that I included. It's NCE consist number 126 for use with Protothrottle V. So to make it more realistic, one important detail that you should include on your layout are mileposts. Here's milepost number 690, and I'll show why that's important. So as you can see on my dispatcher bulletins, I have a 10 mile per hour speed restriction at the 690.5 due to rusty rail conditions, and that's over the crossing at State Route 144. As you can see on the layout, here's the crossing. And this just gives another challenge for the operators to make sure they slow the train down to 10 miles per hour before they enter the crossing. It's another layer of fun. So if you look closely, you can see the milepost 691. I tried to measure it out, although it's way condensed than a real mile, but I thought it would be a good location to put it, to give a good reference point for the crews. And the last milepost is milepost 692, and it's located right here before you get to the bridge at the end of the track here. Another reference point to help the crews out. So along the backdrop, you'll see an old track that's out of service. And if you look on my dispatcher bulletins, you will see at the 690.7, there's an auxiliary track out of service. And it's the old Southland bonded warehouse as account tie conditions. Also in the foreground, you'll see some track material stored that runs along next to the track. On the dispatcher bulletins, I put bad footing due to stored track material, 690.8. So the last thing I'm going to go over for today's video is an actual track warrant on the Seaboard Central. And this is one I just created based off a simplified version of a prototype track warrant, a track authority. And here you see the dispatcher is assigned track warrant number 693 to the TNE SC 2005 at Raglan. Work between is what they selected, between milepost 689 and milepost 693 on the main track. It was copied by TBG at 8:30 a.m. The date, May 14th of 2015. Dispatcher is WBH. Once the crew shows in the clear, they'll report the limits clear back to the dispatcher, and then the track warrant can be voided out. So with our dispatcher bulletins and an active track warrant, we have permission to enter the main line. So I hope you've enjoyed this part 1 of the Realistic Ops series on the Seaboard Central, and you'll tune in next week as we're going to get into a lot more detail on how to make your operations run more like the prototype. So until next time, thanks for watching the Seaboard Central, and happy model railroading, everyone.